Hello and welcome to Holy Wars, a podcast about religion, coexistence, and the people trying to figure it out. My guest today is Todd Green, a professor of religious studies at Luther College, former Presbyterian minister, and author of Presumed Guilty: Why We Shouldn't Ask Muslims to Condemn Terrorism. It was really great to speak with Todd about his book, as well as bigger issues like Islamophobia, Europe, anti-Sharia laws, Catholicism, American foreign policy, Ilhan Omar, and much more. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe, rate it 5 stars, share it with your friends, and donate to my Patreon. Every little bit helps. Thank you, and welcome to Holy Wars. Todd, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Now, you currently teach religious studies at Luther College. What was your background before that?
Well, my previous career was as a Presbyterian minister once upon a time. It's been a while since I've done that. But
Now, which flavor of Presbyterian was this?
Yeah, this was the mainline PCUSA.
Okay.
Yeah, so I spent 4 years as a Presbyterian minister in Waco, Texas, actually.
Oh, wow.
From, 98 to 2002. So, yeah. And then I went back to do my PhD and went this route as my second career.
Yeah, see, I grew up in the PCA.
Oh, did you? I didn't know that.
Yeah, which is the Wahhabi version of the
Right.
the PC
Right.
of the PCUSA. So
Yeah.
I still have. I mean, I'm Catholic now, but I still have this like aversion to the PCUSA, just as like this ingrained kind of thing. Like we used to call you guys like the PC unsaved, or please convert us or something.
That stuff is hard to deprogram, right? I think about that more like with when I grew up. I grew up in Alabama, and the big football rivalry was Alabama and Auburn, and I grew up kind of an Auburn fan. And today I don't really care, and yet when I see Alabama play on TV, I just sort of have this visceral negative reaction to it. And even though I have zero investment in it whatsoever,
right.
It's just kind of that was not my team.
Right, and I think it's worse if the person or the organization is just slightly different from you. Where, like, if someone is Muslim, I'm like, hey, okay, that's fine. But if someone is Episcopalian now, I'm like, look, just become Catholic. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, it's just fake Catholicism, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like the uncanny valley, where if a robot is, if a robot looks nothing like a human, we're fine with it. But if it looks exactly like a human, but just a little bit off, then we have this visceral reaction against it.
Yeah, right.
That's what I think is yeah.
Well, no, and it's
religion.
I mean, I think this is a large issue in what both you and I do, I think, to some extent, which is the intra-religious, the intra-faith conversation debates are sometimes far more difficult than the interfaith ones, even though there's plenty of issues on the latter front as well. But I do think a lot of the fault lines in American religion for a good bit of its modern history have not so much been primarily in terms of in-between religious traditions, but ideological orientations, conservative versus liberal, or social justice oriented versus whatever, right? So.
Right. I was, I had Jordan Denari Duffner on the podcast, and and she was great, and we have that exact experience where our debates with Muslims are more about like sharing ideas and sharing, here's what I think, because someone is far enough from you that you're like, okay, you have a more modest understanding of how the conversation is going to go, hopefully. But if someone is also Catholic and we're talking about Muslims, then it gets pretty intense pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, no doubt, and there's a lot there just within the Catholic tradition alone today. A lot of internal fighting when it comes to some of these larger issues, including outreach to Muslims.
So I read your book, Presumed Guilty: Why We Shouldn't Ask Muslims to Condemn Terrorism. I liked it a lot. You have 3 main theses in here. The first says that we wrongly assume that Islam is the driving force behind terrorism. Now, I know a lot of people listening who are not Muslim or who are just curious about the podcast would see that and be like, well, the terrorists themselves say that the reason they're doing it is because of Islam. So why are they wrong, and why are we wrong to think this?
Yeah, from my perspective as a scholar of religion, the question isn't, does Islam cause terrorism any more than does Christianity cause violence, right, or slavery, or all the other sorts of horrific things that have been done in its name? It's not a question of is it or is it not the cause. It's how does religion get instrumentalized in violence, which is a different kind of question, and it's a more nuanced question, but one we're not particularly adept at raising, much less talking about in public and political discourse about terrorism. But there are a lot of specifics that I get into as to why we need to rethink the way we frame this, and one being that, yeah, you can have someone shouting Allahu Akbar when they're about to engage in an act of suicide bombing. But what does that phrase actually tell us? It tells me very little as a religion scholar, other than that they know the phrase that you and I know who are not Muslim. But it doesn't tell me anything about their level of practice, their depth of knowledge about Islamic texts or traditions or histories or rituals. It doesn't even tell me, if they've been to mosque in the past 5 years, right? Or they observe fasting during Ramadan or anything like that. And we have a number of other studies that I point to in the book that confirm, from Oxford University to the United Nations to Britain's MI5, confirming that a lot of people who are recruited for terrorist organizations actually have very little knowledge of Islam. It's not just a kind of a random speculation. We have data to support this. So that raises the question of then why are they drawn to this to begin with? And then that's when you have to get into the larger social and political factors that drive a lot of terrorism, and where Islam as an ideal or Muslim identity gets instrumentalized in that. But that's not the same thing as saying that it's the cause of it. People don't just open up the Quran, read a few verses, close it, and go blow things up. It's just not how it works.
Right. I was sort of I've talked about this before on the podcast that if Islam did cause terrorism in the way that people say that it does, or if the Quran did cause terrorism, you would expect the top scholars to become terrorists. Like you would expect that as someone's education increased in Islam, that they would become more and more violent. So that like the graduation ceremony at the top, Islamic universities is to go, commit terrorism.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Which is not what happens. Instead, the top scholars of Christianity and Islam usually like each other. They usually teach at same universities, go over to each other's houses, have fun together and have a generally good relationship. So there's something else going on with these things.
Right. It's far more complicated. It's not even logical to draw the conclusion that Islam is the cause of this violence. Sometimes the way I put this in a language that is accessible to a lot of folks is we got to keep in mind that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, self-proclaimed caliph, ISIS, and Malala Yousafzai, Nobel Peace Prize winner, both are Muslim, both read the same book, and they have led two radically different lives. Why?
Right.
If there's something in the Quran, for example, that's causing terrorism, then you would expect Malala to have gone down the same path, right? And not to mention over 1 billion Muslims who have not gone down that path. If Islam is the explanation for why there's terrorism, then Islam is the explanation for why over 1 billion people don't engage in terrorism, right? So. But no one would want to actually admit that who sort of is in the camp of, well, this is all about Islam. So
right, they would say that the people are nice people, in spite of Islam.
Yeah, it's not because of, in spite of. But such a person has never read Malala's work, right? Where she's, frequently quoting from the Quran and from Islamic traditions, and she's just an example that people are familiar with. But so it doesn't make any logical sense, right? The religious scholar wants to know why did Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi go down that one path and Malala down the other, right? What are the other factors in their lives, the historical, political context that shaped them, the family context that shaped them, right? That shaped the way they engaged their religious texts and their traditions, which frankly is the same question I would ask of you or of me for our own traditions. That religion doesn't exist in this social, political, or historic vacuum. But that in many ways the way we engage our traditions or understand our traditions or wield our identities from these traditions are shaped by all these other factors, and that's what I try to get at in the book.
Like even just talking about how a religion would cause violence, like could a religion actually be violent? I mean, just not even talking about Islam, but just like could that actually, like, could you invent a religion that was violent, or is religion a different category than something that would cause violence?
It's a tough question, right? My basic take on religion's phenomenon is that religion, or religions plural even, are not inherently anything. They're not inherently violent or peaceful. You have human beings who interpret their own text and traditions and histories in either violent or peaceful ways, or something in between. And that's the question I tend to gravitate towards as a religion scholar: is what are those other factors that lead one to interpret certain texts or traditions or certain religions as violent or not? Under what circumstances does that happen? But as a historian of religion, particularly when I look at any religious tradition, you will find ample evidence of practitioners doing both, on both ends of the spectrum, and then everything in between. An example I use in American history is just slavery, right? You can find pro-slavery Christians using the Bible to justify it in their own tradition. You can find the abolitionists. You have slaves, of course, who certainly reject the pro-slavery arguments. And they're all reading the same book. They're all digging into the same tradition, but they come out with very radically different, interpretations and conclusions of this. So religion doesn't inherently do anything. Religion is not an actor. Practitioners of religion are actors, right? They actually make decisions about which text they want to elevate and which text they don't, which text they choose to privilege and interpret in certain ways and which they do not, and broadly speaking, into the larger resources of their tradition. And that's how I think we need to talk about religion, as opposed to, is Islam violent, is Buddhism violent, or in theory, is there a religion that could be created that is inherently violent? And in the end, we don't want to take away the human agency aspect of this, which all too often happens with Islam.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Just thinking about free will and how all of this is taking away the free will of people, almost as if like they were agents, and then they became Muslim, and when they became Muslim, they just became enraptured with this system, and that caused violence or something.
Right. I say to my students sometimes, religion is not like the Matrix, right, where you're plugged into some machine, right, and you're just basically following the script that this program has written for you, and that machine now, or that script is some generic thing called Islam, right? We're not downloading software and then automatically acting in a certain way. We're always making choices. That's always been the case with all religions. But yeah, how do we talk about that? How do we sort of remind a broader public of that? How do we remind politicians of this? I mean, the failure to recognize this is really what has led to so much of the Islamophobia that we encounter today, and a lot of the efforts to single out Muslims as a suspect population, as a securitized population, because of an assumption that Muslims themselves are somehow programmed by Islam to be latently violent, right? Or they have violence hardwired into their DNA, and that's just a fundamental, it's not only bigoted, but it's a fundamental misunderstanding of religion. The problem is that most of us in the United States, for example, we don't have much training in the study of religion. There's not much emphasis on this in public schools, and that could be tricky anyway. And most people don't go into college or university to study religion in an academic sense. So we tend to have very shallow understandings of how religion works, and that's what we need to change, I think.
You can learn a lot about a religion and then have no idea how that religion functions in people's lives. One thing I was thinking about recently, I go to therapy. I have a therapist, and I was trying to explain one common thing that we go through is my being raised religious and these sort of religious concepts. And my therapist isn't very religious; he grew up religious, and I'm trying to explain these concepts, and it's very difficult to explain how religion functions in your life to someone who's not religious or who didn't study it. Because there's a lot of assumptions that people can make, and even trying to explain it to someone who's Muslim, like how this theology functions in my life, and it's difficult. And I can't even imagine how someone who had no idea about Islam would be able to understand how it actually functions in people's life, instead of just reading it on Wikipedia and being like, oh well, if this is the doctrine, then this must be how it carries out.
Right. I think that the broader two categories that religion scholars work with all the time that are important to try to convey to the larger public is, one is lived religion, which is what you're talking about, right? Catholicism, it's not just something you read on the page of a Wikipedia article, right? It's something that's put into practice in the people's lives, and though there are certainly you can talk about centralized teachings and authority in the Catholic tradition. The truth is, Catholics are quite diverse in the way that they also live out their religious traditions, and so it's important to keep that in mind. And that's also leads to this larger category of religious literacy. Religious literacy isn't just learning information about religious traditions; it's learning how they're different practitioners of different religions put those teachings or those texts or traditions into practice. And that's something we forget all too often when we are talking about religion, broadly speaking, and particularly about Islam. All right, Islam is, again, on its own is not an actor, but Muslims are. Right, Islam. I try to encourage my students when I teach to say, the question isn't what does Islam believe? What does Christianity believe? Christianity doesn't believe anything. Christians do.
Right.
Islam doesn't believe anything. Muslims do, though. They believe a lot of different things depending upon who you're studying, what time period you're studying, what sort of orientation within Islam that we're dealing with. And that's just as true of Christianity as well. And the way I put this, particularly using Catholicism as an example, even with a centralized tradition like that, right? You can have a Vatican teaching about birth control. But that is not the same thing as whether all American Catholics practice it, right? I mean, that's the live religion piece. And yet they may practice birth control and still see themselves, define themselves as Catholic. And does that make it complicated? Yeah, it does. Makes it complicated. Welcome to the study of religion, right?
Right.
Catholic practitioners, Catholic believers live out that tradition in ways that sometimes are in tension with more central official teachings. And that's with Catholicism. Imagine Islam, which is not a centralized tradition at all,
right?
In terms of the enormous diversity within it. So trying to have conversations about religion with those messy dynamics at a time when all the political gravity that we encounter here in the United States is to try to simplify things and to cut out the nuance and to take shortcuts when it comes to how we understand religion as an actor is part of the problem.
So let's talk for a second about what actually does cause terrorism. One of the things you bring up in the book is the search for family and kinship and people feeling disconnected, and that's possibly one connection. And I think about a lot of the right-wing trolls online who I deal with quite a bit, and there has been among, I think it's fair to say among white people, a sort of breakdown of thick networks and thick families, and there's a sort of being adrift. And I think that for a lot of people, this has caused a search for meaning and for connection that a lot of these extremist groups, latch onto. And I used to joke that I sort of understand ISIS because it's hard to make friends in your 30s, because it's this ready-made network that you can go into, and it has this these feelings or whatever. And I don't know if you've seen that in your own studies, and what could actually be done to change that.
No, I think in terms of some of the more prevalent theories out there, particularly in the social sciences about terrorism, one of the sort of strands of thought here is that a lot of would-be recruits to terrorist organizations, and could be ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but this could be white supremacist and far-right or right-wing terrorist organizations. They're looking for a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose and meaning, family, what social scientists call fictive kinship, right? And if you're an alienated person, particularly a young man, let's say with a Muslim background and you live in Britain, and even if you're doing okay, even if you're kind of middle class, right, but you're made not to feel at home, made to feel that you don't fully belong in Britain because you're not white enough, right? And you have a religious identity or background that is still deemed foreign or at odds with British values. And yet, if your grandparents came from Pakistan, and you go back to Pakistan, you're not going to belong there either, right? They're going to say, "Hey, you're British," and you have no sense of belonging. And then a group like ISIS comes along and says, "Well, you'll never belong there, but you belong here. Well, we have a sense of brotherhood. We have a kinship. We have a family here, and we'll give you a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of glory and honor, and et cetera, et cetera." And that sort of stuff can be attractive, and you don't have to know much of anything about Islam. In fact, I think ISIS thrives on trying to recruit people who actually don't know much about Islam. I think that helps them, helps their cause. But they also know how to leverage that sense of not belonging. But that's not unique to people with a Muslim background. I think right-wing extremists do the same thing. And even when we're not talking about terrorism or extremists in any kind of technical right, but other kinds of organizations that engage in violence, even militaries, right? To tell me that the U.S. Army doesn't try to build a fictive kinship, right? A sense of brotherhood and belonging, and that you fight.
Yeah, they have commercials where the guy fights a dragon with a fire monster with a sword.
Right. I think he wins, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, this idea of the band of brothers, as one scholar calls it, right? That that this is how you transition people into these violent organizations, is giving them a sense of connection and connectivity. But in the 21st century, in year 2019, you don't even have to do that in person. You can do that through the internet. You can do that through social media, and that's a phenomenon we have to take seriously. Even the New Zealand terrorist attack, right, is a guy who seems to have been quote unquote radicalized by the internet, but also found a sense of connection and meaning and purpose through other people with similar ideas that he was encountering online. That sense is almost that was his sense of belonging, and we have to take that seriously.
Yeah, how would we even begin to interrupt that?
Right. One way is to start to recognize that whatever ideologies are put out there in terms of whether it's white nationalists, white supremacists, Muslim extremists, or whatever, that usually beneath those ideologies is something like this, right? These other social or political factors. So you have to address those conditions. It's one of the reasons I say that one of the best ways to help ISIS in its recruiting is to promote Islamophobia. You want to help ISIS do its job, be Islamophobic, right? Pass Islamophobic policies, engage in anti-Muslim rhetoric, fuel the sense of unbelonging, and you'll do their job for them. So how do we combat that? We combat Islamophobia, right? We combat bigotry, we combat racism, both in the rhetoric that we hear from politicians and in the policies that are passed on both sides of the Atlantic, and find ways to give people who belong to communities that tend to have been outcast, right, or are not considered fully British or fully German or fully American, to create societies and communities where there's a greater sense of belonging and buy-in from diverse racial, religious, cultural groups, which is what we're struggling with right now. Right now, we're encountering the exact opposite, Jeremy, in terms of the rise and the growing strength of far-right movements that are doing the exact opposite of this, and that's one of the reasons we're struggling with challenging Islamophobia. But if we prioritize that, I do think you would see a drop in people who would be attracted to these ideologies and these movements.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit more about that. I know that you wrote about how Islamophobia functioned in the 2016 election and also the primaries with Ben Carson and Ted Cruz, and then you also. But I wanted to ask you about that and about how the anti-Sharia bills, and then also how it's functioning today with the rise in the populism in Europe.
Yeah, well, one of the things you've seen getting worse is the intertwining of election politics, presidential politics here in the United States, and parliamentary politics abroad in Europe, and Islamophobia, with far-right movements and politicians really starting to recognize that tapping into anti-Muslim fear or anxiety or hostility and then instrumentalizing that and leveraging it for political gain is actually a winning strategy. It works. These aren't oops moments. These aren't politicians stumbling with their words. They know exactly what they're doing, and they know that it will work. And so we have seen this happen on both sides of the Atlantic. And to the extent that it does work, they will continue doing it, and if not even doubling down on this strategy. The United States is a very interesting example. I've got plenty of complaints about Islamophobia in the Bush administration, but when you looked at actual presidential election cycles, and say 2004, starting there, you had very little of the overt Islamophobic stuff. You had more
right.
the implicit stuff, but Bush never would have come out and said things like Islam hates us, right? Or in this total, complete shutdown of Muslims entering the country, or patrolling Muslim neighborhoods. The stuff that was coming out in the 2015-16 election cycle. It takes a little time for us to get there, but presidential election cycles are good sort of metrics, right? To sort of pause and see how this gets worse and how it gets instrumentalized. And so that's what we've been seeing. Trump has done it because it works. And has a lot of success to it. And I predict that as we enter into this more full throttle into this election cycle, even though there's not a Republican primary, but I think by the time of the general election, you'll see a lot more of this. I think you'll see some of the same strategies we saw in 2016, and I think we'll see a few new ones, including sort of this idea that Muslims are inherently anti-Semitic. I think that is a strategy.
Yeah, I think it's a really big one.
Yeah, it's a strategy that's been trotted out in the past several months, particularly with the debates over Ilhan Omar, that I think the Republican Party sees as a winner, and will keep using. But they will use the older strategies as well, from from immigration and migration to this notion of creeping Sharia, which is actually now, I would say, is a part of the Republican Party platform.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about Ilhan Omar for a second, because I noticed this like right when it first started. I was like, this is probably a pretty good strategy, where they're using. There is this divide among Democrats about Israel and about anti-Semitism, because the old guard in the Democratic Party, very pro-Israel, and the younger people, more critical of Israel, more likely to be pro-Palestinian, whatever. And that's a wedge that they can use and have used pretty effectively. Is okay, get the old guard who are running for office, who are running for presidential, the candidate, get them to do you reject or do you support this policy? And it's been pretty successful in causing infighting among the Democratic Party. So.
And I think, again, it's very strategic, right? I'm obviously not in favor of this strategy at all.
Oh, I know.
But if I were to turn to the other side, right, I would say, this is exactly what you do. And you make it difficult for Democratic candidates and leaders to sort of position themselves. I think this has particularly been the case with debate over Israel conflated with debates over the first black Muslim woman who's been in Congress, right, Ilhan Omar. She's become in many ways a proxy for these larger debates. And I think, again, the Republican Party, not just Trump, but many others in the Republican Party see that as a winning strategy, that to put her in the headlines as much as you can and to cast doubts and questions about her devotion to America, right, about her devotion to U.S. policy in Israel, conflating some of her statements with maybe sympathy with 9/11, things like that, right? But Ilhan Omar has become a campaign strategy, and I have no doubt that they will continue to find ways to do that. But it's not accidental that this is all revolving around a person who's black, Muslim, a woman, progressive, refugee. All the things that generate anxiety from Trump and some of his most ardent supporters and surrogates. So I think we'll see Ilhan Omar factor into the election in many ways as a way to sort of funnel Islamophobia in ways that don't always call attention to all Muslims, but it's meant to raise those questions about all Muslims, precisely because Omar herself will be deemed as the sort of the Muslim spokesperson, right? That we're all supposed to look to as the authority on this. And if she's cast in a negative light constantly, I think they see that as a winning strategy.
It is interesting, and I noticed this a while ago with CARE. Is that the perception that people have of CARE or Ilhan Omar in the wider public, on Fox News or whatever, is very, very different from the perception that people have like within the Muslim community, where in the wider public, these are like far right, like extremist Muslim organizations pushing Sharia. And within the Muslim community, there's like a pretty big debate about like, are we going too far left?
Right. It's and this is a reminder that for those of us who are trying to counter Islamophobia, how we've been on the losing side for a long time, which is not a fun thing to say. But the PR campaign against CARE is a good example of that. I think a lot of that happened with the Holy Land Foundation trial back in the Bush administration, and CARE being named an unindicted co-conspirator in that, and sort of trying to connect CARE with Hamas and things along those lines. That basically, if you think this in terms of branding and marketing, and CARE has been branded by the far right in a way that has stuck in many ways. So this has become very then difficult to push back on it, even though, again, you're right. If you look within Muslim communities, there's a very different take on all of this. But if you look in the broader public or amongst politicians on the right end of the spectrum, they really have succeeded over a long period of years in trying to brand CARE and other Muslim civil liberties organizations as terrorist sympathizers, as Hamas sympathizers, basically organizations that we're not supposed to be able to trust. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here. I think it's a lot of what's going on behind efforts to label the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization.
Right, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, it's just a way of opening the door then to taking aim at Muslim civil liberties organizations, many of whom are accused of being fronts for the Muslim Brotherhood, but as a way of silencing them, because they see organizations like CARE as, in some ways, some of their biggest threats and obstacles when it comes to a lot of the policies, both the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and some domestic policies around security here at home, not to mention, of course, Israel, Palestine. So how do you silence them? You label them Muslim Brotherhood and then turn around and try to label the Muslim Brotherhood itself as a terrorist organization, and that's going to put Muslim organizations in a quandary, irrespective of what their own affiliations actually are.
Right, and not just civil liberties organizations like CARE, but just regular charities, the whole network of like ISNA and ICNA and Helping Hand and stuff, where if the Muslim Brotherhood got designated a terrorist organization, then they would then try and connect all of those together. And then basically every Muslim in America has at some point, maybe not everybody, but a lot of them have, especially ones who are, professionals or, doing pretty well, they've had some sort of connection to those organizations at some point. And so now they have like ties to terrorist organizations, whatever.
Right. It's a great point. It's and it's a reminder that this, these conversations have been taking place for a long time on members of the far right, including people like Ted Cruz, about labeling the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. It has nothing to do with Muslim Brotherhood as an international organization at all. It has a lot to do with domestic politics and basically trying to criminalize Muslims in a way that's sort of shielded and cloaked under the guise of the war on terror, broadly speaking. But this has very little to do with Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or Jordan or anywhere else. It has a lot to do with anxiety about Muslims here, Muslims as political obstacles to far-right ambitions here in the United States.
Yeah, one of my big successes and moments in my comedy career was when Pam Geller wrote a thing about me and said that I was supported and funded by the Muslim Brotherhood comedy circuit. That's the exact phrase she used.
That sounds like something she would say, yeah.
And I just love the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood having a comedy circuit.
Well, and I want to know what that paycheck looks like, too.
I know. And how they're getting the money to me from their jail cells in Egypt.
Exactly. No,
yeah.
A couple of years ago, Robert Spencer accused me of being... Because I had... a lot of what I do when I speak on the Islamophobia industry is talk about their funding and the massive amount of money they have and where some of the sources that it comes from and how much money people like Geller and Spencer get paid. But Spencer, in some sort of counter speech, accused me of being part of this well-funded network, or maybe it was a Saudi well-funded network, and I'm like, wow, I have yet to get that paycheck because my income does not reflect that I'm funded by anybody.
He's pretty popular among Catholics who don't know any better.
No, he is. You're right.
He's on all of the interview shows, and if you go to the Islam section of Catholic bookstores, it's Robert Spencer, and so if you're just like a Catholic person, like go to your local bookstore, look under Islam, and there's some good stuff in there. But I was congratulating Jordan, Donar Duffner about the book, just so that there would be other books in the section, like other than his.
No, he really has made inroads in the Catholic amongst Catholics, and in fact, when when I do public speaking, I do quite a bit of public speaking on Islamophobia, but when I encounter someone in an audience who's really sympathetic to or just loves Robert Spencer, 9 times out of 10 is a Catholic. Which is not to say that all the Catholics in my audiences are like that, but there are channels within the Catholic Church, even in more informal channels, that seem to have promoted his work over the years. On top of the fact that you find him in Catholic bookstores. I think his book. Last time I was in the Basilica bookstore in Washington D.C., his book was there. Actually, it was featured prominently. And I know people have complained about that, but it doesn't make much of a difference. So there's an internal issue in the Catholic Church in America when it comes to the Islamophobia industry, and some Catholic media outlets have really helped this and fueled this, and that's a larger challenge to push back against, I think.
Tell me about some of the efforts that people are making against Muslims in the United States, or some of the just expressions of Islamophobia, particularly anti-Sharia bills. What are those?
Anti-Sharia bills first emerged in earnest, I would say, in 2010. I think Oklahoma was the first state to try to pass one. But they're orchestrated legislative efforts led by some folks within the Islamophobia industry. David Yerushalmi, Frank Gaffney has a lot of interest in this stuff, but there's actually a lot of folks in this industry that have even crafted the language of these bills that didn't get introduced in state legislators to ban Sharia law. Although if you now call that out by name, it raises legal issues. So what Oklahoma learned was that you can't actually name it as such. So usually they're named in such a way as international law or whatever. But the context politically is always we need to pass some kind of legislation that prohibits foreign religious law from being imposed in the United States, even though legally that's just redundant. No religious practice or legal teaching could trump constitutional law anyway. That's just true of all of us, no matter what religion we belong to. You can't cite canon law to circumvent the Constitution. You can follow canon law to the extent that it doesn't conflict with the Constitution. So there's no need to ban any kind of religious law or specify a tradition, but that's not the point here. This is not about whether you need it. It's about stirring up fear and anxiety over Muslims and their efforts, the perception that there are these efforts to impose some kind of foreign law, restrictive law that's in conflict with the U.S. Constitution, in conflict with American values. It's a fake problem. It's a solution, this legislation looking for a problem, but there is no problem to begin with. Muslims also about 1% to 2% of the population. They're not in a position to impose anything on anybody here. That religious community would be called Christians. But
right. Well, and people way overestimate the number of Muslims there are in the United States.
Well, and that's true in Europe as well, and that's not accidental as well. That's the racializing component of this, right? But it's a strategy that's worked at the state level. Over a dozen states have passed this legislation. The majority of states in the United States have at least considered anti-Sharia legislation. But this is an easy sort of thing for the far right, the political right. This is an easy winner because there isn't much pushback against it, not much that's orchestrated. In fact, after the last election, after the last presidential election, in 2017, early 2018, if you went on the Trump-Pence re-election website and the Republican National Committee's website, each had a questionnaire of a number of questions that people were supposed to go through and give responses to. But one of the questions on each of those questionnaires was, do you fear the spread of Sharia law? All right, that was a question on the Republican National Committee's questionnaire. It was supposed to be a serious question, right? So that's sort of a signal that what had started with local and state initiatives has now become something that's moved more to the national platform, and I think we'll see that trotted out again, as we saw in the 2016 election. People like Ben Carson and others fear-mongering over Sharia. But I will say this too, particularly given who I'm talking to and who some of your audience is that this idea that there is this un-American or foreign religious community that's trying to impose some sort of foreign religious teachings or laws or practices on an unsuspecting, Christian or in some cases Protestant America. I mean, that is not new to Muslims, right? This is Catholics were on the receiving end of similar stereotypes back in the 19th and early 20th century. This is Jews, even Mormons, who are about as American as you get in terms of their origins, right? But this idea that they're imposing some kind of dictatorial, oppressive religious system that's going to threaten the rights and the freedoms of unsuspecting Christians or Protestant Christians. That's not a new tactic. So what we're seeing here with Sharia fear mongering is an old tactic that's been recycled, and it's being recycled because, again, the perception is that it works, that it generates, frustration and strong feelings amongst certain portions of the electorate, gets them to the polls, and I think we're going to see this continue with Sharia in this upcoming election cycle. Just, mark my words, we'll hear a lot more about Sharia in the next couple of years.
Well, I think people imagine that, like Sharia being part of jurisprudence or whatever, that what would happen is a judge there would be some case, and then he would rule based on Sharia. But I think people don't even realize how much like religious law actually does get inserted into law. Like, just for example, if something happened to me and I was in a coma, and I put in my will or whatever that you had to contact this Catholic bioethicist as far as what to do, right? The judge would see that and would assume those were my wishes. And there's all sorts of things where if you can put in your will that this has to be discharged according to Sharia or according to this, Presbyterian law. I don't know, there is such a thing, but, and that's fine. And like the history of the United States, like there's tons of cases where, the judges have to interpret religious law, or foreign law based on, if people get married in Israel and then they come here and they have a kid, whoever the judge has to determine, are they actually married? Which means they have to interpret foreign law.
Yeah, no, this does happen quite a bit. This is why some of the more prominent advocates of, people standing by Muslims as they've been subject to this Sharia fear-mongering and the legislation have been Jews, and some Catholics too, right, who recognize you do this, right? Whatever the real effect of the law is, it's usually not much of anything. But what you really are doing is trying to open the door to something that's much larger that's going to affect a lot of communities. So the targeting of Muslims could open the door to the targeting of many religious communities down the road. And so it's important to think about that because, Jews, Catholics, Muslims, amongst many others, right, all the time are engaged in, looking to the religious tradition to guide them on marriage, divorce, inheritance in the case of Muslims, right? All sorts of things, not to mention a lot of their daily lives is following various legal prescriptions in their traditions. When Muslims do ablution for prayer, that's Sharia, right? And they're trying to be,
right.
Kind to their neighbors or to the poor. That's Sharia, right? So where do we draw the line here? But it's about fear mongering. It's not about anything that's a real threat. If Muslims or Jews or Catholics or anyone else were trying to follow a religious teaching and put it into practice in a way that violated the constitutional rights of somebody, I mean, that would be caught in the courts, and it has been before. So the other thing here, of course, is just the word Sharia is supposed to scare the hell out of us, right? We're not. I can't think of many people I've encountered in the larger public who, even if they think they know something about Sharia, they often know less than they even think they know in terms of what it is, how it works, the history of Islamic law, the different schools of law in Islam, the diversity of interpretations for much of the history of Islam. It's all about sort of, generating anxiety and fear, not about something that we know anything about. In fact, my favorite story with this is in Alabama when their anti-Sharia legislation was being debated some years ago. The state senator who introduced the legislation was later cornered by a journalist in his hometown of Anniston, Alabama, and was asked, the journalist asked the state senator to clarify what Sharia was. And the guy responded with, "Well, I don't have my notes on me. I'll have to get back to you." Right? Wait, you just proposed a law to ban something that you don't even know what it is.
Right.
Which is basically what he was saying, right? And I was like, well, that's in a nutshell what's happening here.
I think one of the most successful memes to go viral and to get infected into the minds of people in the West is this idea of taqiyya, which you briefly mentioned. Tell the audience what that is and why it's been so prevalent and why people keep asking about it.
Well, what it is and what it has been constructed to be by politicians are not the same thing, right? Or the Islamophobia industry. What it is actually a doctrine that kind of emerges out of Shia Islam, and it has an analog in Sunni Islam as well. But it's the idea that if you are a Muslim who finds yourself under duress or in a situation of persecution where your life or the lives of your family members or loved ones are under threat, that you can withhold your true religious identity. And that can be in a context in which the threat comes from someone who's not Muslim, but it could also be if you're a Shia Muslim in a Sunni majority context. So it can be an internal sort of practice as well. What it has been constructed as in the recent years is that Islam commands Muslims to be deceptive, to hide their true intentions, which is to take over, again, unsuspecting Western countries and impose Islamic law on and to subjugate people who are not Muslim. This is this is sort of what taqiyya has now been turned into by bad faith actors and people from the Islamophobia industry and those who have followed their script. People again like Ben Carson, who invoked taqiyya back in the 2015-2016 election cycle as something that Muslims are trying to do. They're trying to they're deceiving us, right? Again, it's made to sound like this is something unique to Islam, but in the context of American religious history, Muslims are not the first religious minority community to be cast as deceptive. People who are withholding their true intentions, who are lying to us. Catholics, who are, particularly the Catholic hierarchy, was cast and framed in that same way back in the...
Yeah, the Jesuits.
Yeah, absolutely. The Jesuits are the foot soldiers of the Vatican.
Mental
right?
reservation, right?
Yeah, and they're going to do it under education or whatever, right? But what they're trying to do is to take over. Of course, in the anti-Semitic trope of the shifty Jew, right? The Jews themselves are deceptive, but again, secretly orchestrating things behind the scenes and controlling or trying to control and take over, populations where they're very much in the minority. So this isn't new, but again, it works. It's been recycled and then rebranded with Muslims because it works. And it wasn't really something that you found in a prominent way amongst Islamophobes a decade ago. In fact, I remember about 5 or 6 years ago in an audience where I was starting to talk about the emergence of this taqiyya strategy, and I had Muslims who didn't know what I was talking about.
Yeah, oh yeah. No, none of the Muslims that I know had any idea what it was like 5 years ago.
They had no idea they were supposed to be lying to us and trying to impose the Islamic State here. But again, it doesn't matter about the truth of this. This is about trying to enhance and heighten and stir up stereotypes of these kind of worst possible features and characteristics of Muslims, so that we don't trust them. And it's sort of ingenious, right? It's a simplistic strategy in many ways, but the idea of then when we encounter Muslims who are good, quote unquote, good Muslims, right? You can't even trust them, right? If they say that if they condemn terrorism, don't worry about that. They're just lying to you because taqiyya tells them that they're supposed to lie to you to hide their true intentions. So it's a way of silencing and erasing the voices of Muslims from the public discourse and public debate, and to have others take over that narrative and co-opt it for.
That's a really good point. Like you never have to entertain the idea that you got something wrong.
Right. Nope, they're lying. Yeah.
So it's not that you. So if somebody takes your class, for example, and they you give them a test on Islam and you say they got like a 70 on it, they're like, no, I didn't.
Right.
Like you're lying.
Yep. No, that door is open, right? You're not telling me the truth about Islam.
Yeah. I actually got 100 on it.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's not Islamophobic. There's no such thing, right? It's a way to again silence the voices of Muslims and to silence their perspective on Islam and to co-opt Islam and its larger story for larger financial and political gain. And again, it's a strategy we've seen in more recent years. It wasn't back in the 2009, 2010 with the emergence of the quote unquote Ground Zero mosque controversy. That was not a tactic that was employed in any kind of significant way back then. But in the past several years, it has become quite prominent, and wouldn't surprise me again if we see this in the upcoming election, if not at the presidential level, certainly at some of the local and state levels.
And the other thing, we have about 10 minutes left, but I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Muslims being asked to reject terrorism. I mean, the entire thing of your book, the entire thesis of your book is about, we shouldn't ask Muslims to condemn terrorism. And obviously, when Muslims do condemn terrorism, the taqiyya thing comes up. Oh, well, they're just pretending to condemn it. But is it that people don't know that Muslims have condemned terrorism, or is it just like a trolling thing where if you constantly get them to do it, it just like keeps them in that cycle of it?
Right. That's a very good question, and I do give a lot of thought about how much of this is just people ignorance, right? Simple ignorance. People just don't know, and if they get informed by it, they'll change their tune. They will stop asking the question. And how much of this is really about a larger discourse at work that really is meant to silence certain perspectives and to, in my opinion, distract us from a more difficult conversation. And in the larger public discourse, particularly among politicians who ask this question, no, I'm long past the stage of giving them the benefit of the doubt. In the year 2018, 19, no. If you're still asking Muslims to condemn terrorism under the assumption that they're not, that's not simple ignorance. That is deliberate. That's my operating assumption now. And it's strategic, and it's meant really, again, to keep the focus, the spotlight on Muslims and violence and Muslims and terrorism, so that we don't have to have a much more difficult conversation about what I talk about in the third part of the book, our own violent past of the United States and in Europe, and our ongoing complicity in a violent world order. A lot of the conversations and debates and the hand-wringing about Muslims and terrorism, in my opinion, are a distraction. I think racism and Islamophobia, fundamentally, and as they're employed in public discourse, are about distraction, keeping us focused on Muslims so that we don't have to do any soul-searching for ourselves. And I spend a lot of time in the third part of the book talking about that horrific history that, in my experience, people don't know much about. I teach students coming out of public school who know nothing about Christians' involvement in the Holocaust, Christians in the Inquisition, Christians in torture, on and on. Slavery, right? They know slavery is bad. They know it happened, but the extent to which Christians use the Bible to justify it, they're encountering that in my class for the first time. And they've gone through public school education. Some of them pay attention to the media and the news as well, right? So why don't they know that? But they would be very quick to sort of call ISIS Islamic terrorism, but not slavery Christian terrorism. And that's the kind of stuff I'm really interested in, is how we've gotten there. But no, many journalists and politicians today, if you're still asking that question of Muslims, it's not simple ignorance. You should know better, and if you don't, then there's a larger ethical questions that need to be addressed, and even to the extent of why you don't know that, right? When I say in the book a simple Google search, 10-second Google search will give you the answer to that question. And we Google things all the time. You and I probably Googled several times today, right? But we don't know how to Google Muslims condemning terrorism. Are you kidding me? Of course we do. If we think not to do that, then why? That has something to do with our own prejudice, right? And something that we need to call attention to in terms of that. And that's what I think is a lot of what's going on here. But I do try to move in the direction in the book, and I try to do this a lot when I speak these days, is trying to raise the larger question of what is the larger function of Islamophobia. And I take Toni Morrison as sort of my starting point, when she said back in the 1970s, I believe, she said that the function, the very serious function of racism, is distraction. It's meant to keep African Americans on the defensive, so they're constantly having to defend themselves, their history, their contributions to America, their very existence. They're doing this to a population that never seems fully convinced, so they have to keep doing it over and over again. And she says, you know what, this is exhausting for African Americans. But that's what racism does. It tries to exhaust you. Of course, what it also does is it distracts the majority population from doing its own sort of serious soul-searching and homework when it comes to its own history. And what I try to do in the book eventually is to lift up for a broader audience what that history is, and the history of white Americans, white Europeans, and white Christians participating in some horrific violence, all of which are categories of violence that we accuse ISIS of. Is pretty extensive. It's not minor. It's not peripheral to our history. It's very much central to it, including the attempted genocide of Native Americans on the land that we're sitting on. You and I are both sitting on today. But that's not the kind of violence that we want to talk about or remember. We'll build a huge memorial in New York City to 9/11 and always say never forget. But I do not know where the equivalent of the 9/11 Memorial Museum is for Native American genocide or for lynchings or Jim Crow violence or slavery or anything like that. We don't remember those kinds of violent episodes in the same way. And that's strategic. And that's where Islamophobia comes in the equation, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was going to ask why you think that is, why we treat the seemingly comparable actions as totally different. Like, is it just the kind of thing where it's our side and it's their side?
Right. I mean, again, it in many ways it legitimizes the status quo. It legitimizes certain domestic policies and foreign policies that we have today. Torture is a great example of that. We know that there was torture after 9/11 that the United States has sponsored in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, of course, in CIA black sites. What a lot of Americans don't know is that torture wasn't new to the post-9/11 era. We've been torturing for a long time. Europeans have been torturing for a long time. And I'm not just talking about the Middle Ages and, dungeons or the Inquisition or even witch trials in Europe. I'm talking about the 20th century. I'm talking about post-World War II on both sides of the Atlantic. But we don't want to come to terms with that. This idea that we are engaged in the quote-unquote kinds of barbaric violence that we accuse ISIS of. This is very much part of who we are. These are our values. Violence is very much a part of a modern American identity, and to a large extent, modern European identity, given its colonial legacy. But this is not the history one we want to talk about and the history we want to tell. The idea that the categories of violence that we attribute to ISIS, all of them apply to us. Every single one of them apply to us. Holy wars, persecuting religious minorities, attempted annihilation of populations, genocide, torture. That's ISIS, that's us. But we can't talk about it in that way. We don't want to remember it in that way, and that does then legitimize certain kinds of policies today. What I would say is U.S. imperialism and global hegemony, so long as we can justify what we have done or distract the population from what we've done and keep the focus on those quote-unquote barbaric Muslims, we don't have to do any soul-searching. We don't actually have to reconsider the violence we perpetrate and make amends for it.
One of the things that I had this theory that one of the reasons for that is because over time, I guess starting with the Reformation, Christianity began to outsource a lot of its stuff to the state and the market and all these other forces. And so that now Christianity, for the most part, is this sort of belief system you have in your head. You talk, about Protestantism, late in the book. It's this thing in your head. It's a system of belief that you have. It's a list of things that you believe. And then you also have the government, which is separate from it. And what that does is it lets you do these things, torture, kill, bomb, whatever. And then you get to say that it's not because of your faith.
Right, yeah, and that raises a very interesting question, right, about what role do Christians play, for example, in policies carried out by their governments or by people in their community.
Right. So if a Presbyterian drone pilot, bombs a wedding in Pakistan, very few people would say that's because of Presbyterianism, right? But if a Muslim were to bomb somebody in America, we would say, well, that's essential to Islam, because by Christianity, we mean the set of beliefs, and by Islam, we mean everything.
Right, and not asking the larger question of systemic violence and oppression and how a broader population can support that and enable that. It's the argument I tend to fall back on here automatically is the argument that Dr. King put forth in his letter from Birmingham, a letter in which he does not primarily target the KKK, though he certainly takes the shots at them, right? But he targets white moderate Christians who are making the exact argument you just suggested, right? That, the gospel doesn't really have anything to do, or it's not really about this whole social justice stuff. It's about saving souls and that sort of thing. And we're not the ones out there, harassing, civil rights activists and stuff like that. We're trying to call for law and order. And those are exactly the people King sits down to write this letter about and against. In fact, you are complicit in this. If you claim to be a Christian and do nothing, in the face of these grave injustices, Jim Crow, the violence of targeting civil rights, nonviolent protesters, right, then you are part of the problem, that you are complicit in this, precisely because you have the power to change it, which white Christians historically have. And that's a different way of asking a question theologically and ethically than I think many white Christians in America are prone to ask, that if they support a government or they vote for candidates or politicians who then enact these policies, these violent policies, that they are now a part of the problem. They're complicit in the system. And yeah, you're right. That's something that we will impose on Muslims very quickly, but we will not do the same for Christians. And it's one of the reasons I sometimes suggest to Christian communities, if you want to start working through the theological and ethical issues involved in combating Islamophobia, start with Dr. King's letter from Birmingham, which has nothing to do with Islamophobia, but it raises all those questions about Christian identity and those claiming a Christian identity, but saying, you know what, though, we're not the ones on the front lines, doing violence against civil rights professors. We're not the ones bombing churches. Your beef is not with us. And King says, if you're not doing anything about it, you're exactly the people I need to be talking to, and you're exactly the type of folks who are at the center of what this problem is. And frankly, if you're not on our side and fighting this injustice, then you're in the way, and you're creating, you're an enabler to the system. And this is true of all the violence I talk about later in the book, including lynchings. You didn't have to be the white Christian stringing up someone to be complicit in the system. If you stood in the crowd and watched the spectator event, you were complicit. Or if you didn't go to it at all, but you didn't speak out against it, you are complicit. You are part of the population that's in the position of power to stop this violence. And if you didn't do so, ethically speaking, theologically speaking, then you've got a big problem on your hands in terms of why your Christian identity didn't mobilize you and inspire you to challenge this injustice. That is a theological problem that white Christians in America have struggled with historically. We continue to struggle with it today, and I see this play out now with Islamophobia as well.
Let's end this on a happy note for all of our listeners. Ways that we can help fight this, or guidelines. Number one, let people of other faiths define themselves, which I see as a really big problem that we have, where if you read, for example, Robert Spencer's book on Islam, you'll find very few Muslims who think that's a fair description of their faith.
Right. Yeah. There's this kind of in the end of the book, I have these 3 broader rules of interfaith engagement that I borrow from the late Lutheran bishop and former dean of Harvard Divinity School, Christopher Stendahl, that he developed over his lifetime. I tried to then apply them specifically to Christian engagement with Muslims. But one of them is to let people define themselves. Don't let their enemies define them for them, which is what the Islamophobia industry is all about. The enemies of Muslims and Islam who are trying to then define Islam and not allow Muslims to be their own voices and speaking on behalf of their own tradition or articulating what that tradition means to them. But we violate this all the time when it comes to Islam. So just following that one rule alone would change a lot in the public discourse about Islam if the guests that you get on Fox News or CNN, for that matter, when speaking about Islam on any topic are predominantly Muslims, right, and not people who are pseudo-experts or scholars. A second rule of thumb is, in addition to that, is sort of develop holy envy, this idea that there's try to cultivate a kind of a positive appreciation for a different religious tradition, and something that you come to find awe-inspiring about that. I use Obama's statement back in the 2007 election when he was running for the presidency the first time around, that the call to prayer in Islam is one of the prettiest sounds on earth, he says at sunset. And it's this idea that there's something in this tradition that really awakens me and inspires something spiritually within me, or one could even maybe argue ethically within somebody. But of course, you have to learn enough about a religious tradition to develop that kind of envy, which so many of us in the United States just haven't done when it comes to Islam. We still know very little about this tradition. So that's another rule that I try to encourage readers to take into account. Trying to think what the third one is.
Comparing like
with like. Comparing apples to apples, which is what we don't do very well. The idea that, speaking of Martin Luther King, comparing Islam's Osama bin Laden with Martin Luther King and Christianity, and whereas Islam's Martin Luther King, whereas Islam's Mother Teresa, right, or Pope Francis or whatever. which are, just not only are they theological low blows, but they're ignorant. If the question is, where are the peacemakers or in Islam, there's lots of them. They're all over the world, and they're on the ground in the grassroots doing a lot of difficult work and not making the news, not making CNN or BBC or anything like that. And yet they're doing exactly that kind of work. And conversely, there are plenty of scoundrels in Christianity, if we're going to go that route too, right? But you be fair, compare like with like. Don't compare their worst to our best, is the way Stendhal would have put it, which is, again, what we're prone to do, because he argues to some extent many of us are quite narcissistic about our own religious traditions and always want to present them in the best positive light, and then take other religious traditions, but in particular those that are cast as the ultimate existential enemy, and cast them in the worst possible light. And that's exactly what the Islamophobia industry does. It's what many far-right politicians have been doing, and it violates a core interfaith engagement tenet that we need to reject in favor of let's be fair, let's compare like with like, and then when we do so, we'll find a lot of inspirational figures in Islam, just like we can find in Christianity.
And again, you really do have to know a lot about another tradition in order to be able to tell, because one thing I've noticed is that if someone is Catholic and they, or even just broadly Christian, and they are crazy, I can tell right away. Like, based on the stuff they're saying, I'm like, that's not something people say. But if someone is Muslim and they're talking, I actually don't know. I mean, I'm fairly educated, but it takes me a while to actually realize, like, is this person an outlier? Is their theory about the Quran, is that something that people have said before, or is it something that's, an aberration? And is this person actually know what they're talking about? But if you don't know anything about a tradition, you're just like, oh, well, that's obviously what they believe.
Right, and that's the hard work that has to be done here. Interfaith engagement is actually quite messy and difficult, and it's labor intensive, and it takes time to build these relationships, and takes a lot of patience to allow Muslims, in this case, to be our teachers. And when we do, what you discover, as you were just alluding to, is that you might encounter different perspectives, a lot of different perspectives amongst Muslims when it comes to the way they understand the Quran or something else within their religious tradition. And guess what? Welcome to Religion 101. It's messy. Religion is messy. It's I don't have a nice, easy way of putting that, but you also start to appreciate the internal diversity within religious traditions, and you do this firsthand, right, from the voices and perspectives of Muslims themselves, as opposed to hand-selected voices that someone like Robert Spencer or Pamela Geller are going to give you, right, in which they're trying to build a very specific picture of Islam and trying to exploit the level of religious ignorance that we have. But that's what we have to combat here with interfaith engagement, is trying to build up religious literacy. We are, for lack of a better way of putting this, we are a religiously illiterate nation. We don't know much about religion. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, any of it. We're actually quite ignorant about religion as a phenomenon. And the way to do that is to start engaging people of different traditions that are not our own, and to have them become our on-the-ground teachers of the lived religious experiences that they are having, and start to then recognize that we will hear a lot of diverse perspectives in the process, and that's part of the learning process as we move forward.
Well, Todd Green, thank you so much for joining us and for sitting down and for donating so much of your time to this show. Thank you.
I'm glad to do it. Thanks for this conversation. It was wonderful.
That concludes another episode of Holy Wars. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe, share it on social media, rate it 5 stars on iTunes, donate to the Patreon. Like I said, every little bit helps this project keep moving forward. Until next time, I'm Jeremy McClellan. Thank you for listening.